maybe we can sort of start by talking a little bit about your kind of formative experiences with going to the cinema and how they kind of led you to become interested in film watching. But with this podcast, I'm trying to think much more about how we watch as much as what we watch. So the sort of physical being and social context that define our relationship with film and media. So
Yeah.
just an easy one to start is, can you, do you actually have any memory or any kind of sense of the first time you went to the cinema?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, going to the cinema, in I think the actual experience I can remember, it was definitely not the first one, but the one I can remember was Inception. And it was because I watched it in a different language, accidentally. Well, but if you step back for a second, so I was in Austria at the time because my sister lives there. And
Uh-huh.
she was like, yeah, we should just go to the films. Like, we have nothing to do. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. I've heard, Inception is out. We should check it out. And she was like, yeah, let's do it. And I don't know if she actually knew that in Austria, they dub the films. They're not
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
subtitles.
Yeah. In certain
So,
countries, don't they, that they have laws against the subtitles because they want to give their voice actors work, basically.
oh, I mean, amazing. So I go to the cinema and I start listening to DiCaprio speaking some sort of like German language. I'm like, what's going on? And I had to sit through the whole thing because I was too young and terrified to actually just walk out. And my sister spoke the language, so she got what happened. But the reason I bring this up is because it's quite interesting in terms of, my piece as well, like watching things in a very strange, weird,
Yeah.
unconventional way. And I do think that it probably shaped how I think of Inception because I wasn't able to get a single thing from what was, sound wise, but I was able to focus on the visuals. And
Right.
I was able to focus on the technical aspect of the film and like what was Nolan trying to do through moving image as opposed to, like dialogue because I had no idea what was going on. So that was it. That was hilarious. I'm pretty sure I've seen like a bunch of cartoons and things like that and Disney stuff, but
Right.
I don't remember them being formative as much as that one. That made me rethink how we watch in the big screen in a weird way.
Wow. Well, two things about that straight away. Firstly, that makes me feel really old. And secondly, yeah, just on it, it's interesting that because the same thing has happened to me because I'm half Spanish. I think, are you half Greek? Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
You're fully Greek.
yeah, I'm fully
Sorry.
Greek. Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I remember going to the cinema when I was a kid with my cousins in Spain. This is like, I'm talking like early 80s now. And I think we went to see James Bond, right? And I don't know why they took me to the cinema because I didn't speak Spanish very well at all. But then when the first time I heard Mi amo Bond, Senor Bond and all this it's just like, I was like, this is ridiculous. I was like laughing at it,
Yeah.
But I think, you're so right in that idea of changing the conditions that we're so used to that are ingrained in how we expect to consume or watch or spectate. It really can kind of change your perspective on how you understand, your relationship to the film and how you maybe even
Yeah.
analyze or interpret the film.
Especially when, as you said, it helps the industry itself. Like in the case of Austria and other countries, as you mentioned, it actually gives voice actors actual work. So why
Yeah,
not
yeah,
embrace it? Just go to a film. And this leads me to I remember my boyfriend because I did talk about him. He has a very strange way of consuming
Mm,
films and TV shows, and I love that about him. And he was my main inspiration for the
yeah.
piece as well. But he also did say that he watched Babel in not English, even though he's from Scotland, like he only speaks English. And
Right.
I was like, why did you do that? And he was like, I think accidentally, like I think he had the film on Prime. For some reason, the setting was set on a different language. He didn't tell me which language. And I said, wait, so you sat through the whole film in a different language and you didn't question it once? And he said, no, because it's called Babel. So I'm assuming that
Right.
was a point of the film, and it was a sort of art house film where you're supposed to sit through it.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point. And I was like, this is genius. And he
Yeah.
said, I really loved it. I said, okay.
No, it's really interesting when you watch stuff on Prime Particularly, I think this happens on Prime a lot, where, I mean, sometimes the captions are on in English kind of by default, but then if there's a foreign language spoken, it cuts them off. And I'm always thinking
Yeah.
to myself, should I have that translated, as well as the English? But it just depends on the setting. And then suddenly you
Yes.
find yourself having to listen to the foreign language, or even just kind of think, what must they be saying? Just sort of imagining what they're saying rather than really thinking, I know what they're saying in that sense. And that can alter, your perspective of the film quite a bit as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
When you're watching, like, say if you're watching a Greek film, will you have English subtitles on? Because obviously your English is fantastic, but would you always just go back to listening, in Greek and not worrying about subtitles?
No, I don't use subtitles when I watch Greek work. There have been a couple of exceptions, but that's when I had to watch Greek films with people that didn't speak the language. But
Right. Okay.
yeah,
Right.
for some reason I do appreciate the simplicity, and because Greek is a very demanding language on its own, you don't need unnecessary subtitles
Right. Okay. Yeah.
to go with it. Yeah, but
No.
yeah, that's sort of so in terms of cinema experience that I remember. But if I'm honest, I didn't grow up with going to the cinema. I didn't grow up in a family that would take me to the cinema quite often. I think I explored films on my own in a way. And so I watched a lot of stuff at home.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I sort of remember. But it's interesting because my entry into storytelling, from what I remember, was actually, and that may sound crazy, but it did come through Stephen King's books, though not exactly by choice at first. So I did notice that my mom would devour his novels one after another, and I remember as a kid I was desperately searching for ways to connect with her. So I started picking them up as well. So it was, my attempt to bridge whatever invisible gap I felt between us. So if you love the stories, maybe they could give us something to talk about, and that moved into anything Stephen King related. So
Right.
Misery, the Dolores, what's your name? The Kathy Bates, another one.
Oh, yeah. No, I know what
Not
you mean.
Misery, the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pet Cemetery, Sleepwalkers. Like I remember just binge watching through those at the time, and I don't think I was drawn to the gory stuff because King is not about gore. It was more about the psychological
Yeah, the
tension
tension,
that King specialized in. It gave me this jolt of energy that I didn't know I needed at the time. I think I was a bit of a melancholic kid, and that gave me like a very interesting entry point into suspense and plot twists and that sort of narrative structure at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, the cinema as a venue, often people will talk about they go to the cinema because you are on your own, you're in the dark, people are leaving you alone. And then the film comes on and you can immerse yourself in the film world. But people sort of use it as a sort of kind of defense mechanism or a way of dealing with stuff that they don't want to deal with on the outside, perhaps, when you're younger. But I think that works equally as well. Like, say, for example, if you're at home in your bedroom and, when sort of in the 90s, it's very common for people to have DVD players, video players, in the 80s in their rooms. So again, it's sort of, if you think of it historically, that there was probably this migration in where there was a lot of people who became interested in film, but it was part of this sort of culture of growing up, of self-definition in the way that many people will do it through, I don't know, sports or whatever it might be,
Absolutely. And then came television, of course. Yeah, like the mid-2000s television renaissance, anything from The Wire, Sopranos, 6 Feet Under, Arrested Development, like all the classics. I remember, television being that perfect excuse to just retreat from the world, while still feeling connected to something bigger at the same time. Think of that time quite fondly in my bedroom in Athens. Yeah.
And did that kind of inspire you then quite specifically to get into writing, or has that come later on? What was the sort of transition or the thought process where you're like, actually I want to do more with cinema than just watch,
Yeah, I mean, it's a very random story. I was always a very online person. I lived through the, Tumblr era. I was one of the early people on Twitter back in 2008,
Okay.
2009. And I was on Twitter actually running fandom accounts for music bands.
Okay.
So like it's a bit of an odd one. By the time, like, 30 Seconds to Mars, Panic at the Disco, McFly, they were the prime.
Mm.
And I accidentally found myself learning about online community building and art
Okay.
promotion and how to write something effective in a super short format.
Right.
And I really, really loved doing that. And I loved exploring those topics quite a lot. So in what might be the most unhinged move of my teenage years, I actually emailed Ariana Huffington, the Huffington
Wow.
Post founder.
Okay.
I sent over a spec essay about celebrity social media strategy. And surprisingly, 5 days later, she responded asking me to join the contributor. You know what, like,
Yeah.
you know how it was like. But it was a big deal at the time for me.
Mm.
So yeah, I joined the contributor platform of the Post for a few years. So that's how I stumbled into writing and writing about culture. I know things celebrity and film and television. I did a few interviews with TV talent at the time, like Bates Motel, Winona Earp, those like early 2000 shows. So that was my entry point, just having a sort
Right.
of platform that felt legitimate. And it sort of, yeah, grew from there.
Yeah. And uh, has it become more of a? I mean, you say on your website, I think somewhere on the Substack, that there is this transition that's happened where you've been talking about final scenes. That was the kind of device into the pieces that you've written, and then the podcast as well. But then this has become more about exploring a kind of sense of self through cinema, because that's one of the big things that I noticed. So we'll come on to the writing more specifically
Mhm,
in a
mhm.
bit, but it does seem to do this thing which I'm kind of jealous of, which is to be able to kind of explore you know what's happening in my day-to-day life, or how that is intersecting with the way I'm thinking about culture, media, cinema specifically.
Yeah. So, I mean, the journey from Instagram to podcasting newsletter has been this weird but also organic evolution that I never really planned. And I think it also mirrors how social platforms have evolved as well without, my intending that. So that final scene, yeah, started in 2018 as this very specific thing, like analyzing final scenes on Instagram.
Mm.
And something about this format and the angle, because it was so specific, really resonated with people. Maybe focusing solely on endings, gave people this entry point to discuss films in a way that felt both accessible and meaningful. I think people just love talking about final scenes, and
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
found final scenes fascinating at the time. But yeah, what's funny is how long I resisted doing a podcast. Like every Q&A that I was doing with my community, like without fail, someone would ask about it. But the thought of speaking about film, just felt terrifying. And then, yeah, there was this surreal moment that happened when a friend of mine, Simon, who's now one of my co-hosts, called me from a pub and saying he was out with a friend who was talking about that final scene, my page, and how perfect it would be as a podcast, right? So
Mm.
it felt like one of those like cosmic nudges that you can't quite ignore.
Right.
So yeah, to your point, so now we do this bi-weekly thing, one episode where we're just having these relaxed conversations about film. And we bring our community sometimes to, get their perspective as well. And another where we just do those deep dives into final scenes. I still want to maintain an element of that on endings.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's completely different from writing. When you write about film, yeah, it's you can craft those perfect sentences. You
Sure.
can build your argument in a way that takes a lot of time. But yeah, as we mentioned, like English isn't my native language, so there's a lot of rewriting and googling the right words involved.
Yeah.
But yeah, with podcasting, there is this immediate, unpolished quality that actually creates a different kind of insight.
Sure. And did you, with the podcast, and you've got Ben and Simon are your two co-hosts. And what's interesting about that, just talking about voices, because I'm very interested in voices and the voice in a literal and figurative way. Um, you've all got very different accents
Oh,
that are all really good, and but they all complement each other.
Mhm.
I mean, have you ever sort of thought about that and what that brings as a kind of experience for a listener?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I am also the only woman in the mix. And that brings like I think I bring the female gaze and aspect, and I also bring the non, I don't say UK because it's Ireland, like UK and Ireland perspective, which is quite different. So
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting in terms of the points of references that we have, if anything. For me, it's less about the accents, which, yeah, we have received a lot of, compliments in terms of like how, novel it also is to have a podcast sounding like that. But yeah, much more so in terms of points of references. So, Ben and Simon will talk about Peep Show and James Bond, in every single episode. And I'm like, I can't help. I'm just there like listening.
Yeah.
But then I bring this different perspective, like when I push back on certain things, or I may just bring the element of, oh, maybe someone whose first language isn't English would think of this film that way.
Mhm.
So I think it helps more in terms of perspectives. But I haven't thought that much in terms of accents, if it
Yeah.
adds or prevent some people from listening. It could be both.
Well, I mean, I don't think it would ever put anyone off, really. I mean, it's
Mm.
obviously very, I don't know, idiosyncratic in terms
Mm.
of why people listen to certain things and why they turn off from certain
Yeah.
things, let's say. But also, your recording sound is very nice. So you're in.
Mhm.
Do you record in a studio together?
So we record at home, but
Okay.
both Simon and at my home, but both Simon and Ben are producers. Like, and
Okay.
yeah, Simon has decades of experience in radio producing.
Yeah.
So yeah, he knows how to produce a show, which is I'm very grateful for that.
Mm.
Yeah.
And when you're sort of chatting together, there's
Mhm.
definitely that kind of familiarity and ability to sort of be relaxed in listening to what somebody else is saying, but
Yeah.
then also that those moments where there's something productive that actually comes out, which I think is some of the most interesting parts of podcasting, where
Hmm.
somehow between the two people something new emerges in terms of an understanding of a film or an insight, let let's say. And I think that when I was listening to you were talking about like a complete unknown,
Hmm.
various other things, and uh, uh, the sort of relationship or the difference between black doves and
Yep.
what is it, slow horses, right?
Yep.
But it's interesting because I'm always when I'm listening all the time, I'm always kind of either nodding or disagreeing in my mind. So I was just wondering that in terms of the way that you think about um, how you structure the podcast and how you're going to talk. It seems very free form, very kind
Hmm.
of unscripted or unstructured
Yeah.
in a sense. But do you have a not a tight kind of script, let's say, but a rundown about, okay, we're going to go in this way and that way, or do you just kind of let it happen?
The only thing we sort of align on beforehand is the time we're gonna spend on each topic. So we time ourselves
Right.
to make sure that Simon doesn't spend half a day cutting down rants or vents about
Right.
things,
Right.
and also align beforehand on the final scene. But I think we purposefully made sure to keep this as free flowing as possible because it's the number one thing we hear from listeners that they actually love. Like the number one, and we make it very clear we're not film critics. Like our opinions are often quite uninformed, but I think we own that, not from a like pretentious point of view, but to make the point that this is the type of conversation you could have with your friends and you're just
Right.
listening in. And this is the number one thing we hear from listeners, that I feel like I know you guys. Like, if you don't drop an episode, 1 week, I feel like, I need my dose. Like we sort of, with that format, we have managed to create this almost parasocial relationship
Yeah. Yeah.
with our listeners. So that's what we aim for.
Mm.
um, we used to have a much better outline and almost like script and questions like that, but I personally found that it didn't work as well.
Mm.
Mostly because I was the one showing the most prepared, and I was like, oh, like Like it doesn't quite land if I'm the one doing the prep, and then the like Ben and Simon, go to someplace else.
Right? Do I detect some gender dynamics that weren't benefiting you for a while there?
Yeah. But also, I want to acknowledge that I recognize that for them, it's just a case of showing up and being present in the moment. That's what I can ask for, because ultimately the brand is mine. So the
Right. Okay.
responsibility of how it shows up externally is on me. They don't, like, the stakes are much higher for me. So I get that. But also, yeah, because we're not monetizing the podcast, I wouldn't expect them to have to spend like 3 hours a week to just
Yeah.
prep beforehand. So yeah, we're leaning to what draws people in, and that's the relationship and friend aspect. Which, to your point, it will present, some arguments here and there, which are very real. And I think we present that side of the story, that you sit down, you have a disagreement with someone, you try to come to a certain resolution, as opposed to just being too safe and saying the right things because they're pre-scripted and pre-outlined. So we are leaning into that, and I feel like it's working quite well for our audience so far.
Yeah. Have you ever got into quite a heated "no, you're wrong" type of debate?
We had a couple of examples quite recently. I mean, the first one being around Gladiator
Okay.
2, which we did. We didn't do like obviously a final scene deep dive, because there was nothing to analyze about that ending. But there was the review aspect, because me and Ben watched it, and I was making the point that, what, it wasn't great, but I had a good time. Denzel Washington did his thing, whatever. Sharks in the Colosseum, like, whatever. It's like, it's so camp. You just have to, as long as you understand what the film is about, you either have to sit back and enjoy the ride or walk out. But then Ben was just, quite mean to the film, which I didn't think it was quite fair. We had a bit of a back and forth. I think his argument was more convincing than mine, because I was just like, yeah, I was entertained, it was fine. And he was like, no, what about this scene and that scene? And that was dreadful, it was horrible. No, like, it was the worst thing that, Scott has ever done in his life. And I was like, well, I can't fight. I don't have that level of energy about Gladiator 2. So whatever.
Yeah.
And then recently, I think I'm about to share this episode with our listeners, but we had and you can jump to this, but we had a bit of a, not disagreement, but they started talking about James Bond again, and they go so niche on the franchise, and I literally cannot participate. I have seen only the Daniel Craig films. I know nothing about the legacy of James Bond. I appreciate it. I'm probably not gonna watch them anytime soon. And I started talking about Zone Dillman, which I saw recently, last week.
Is that the first time you'd seen John Dillman?
That was the second time.
Okay.
But it was the first time I saw it on the big screen.
Okay.
And I was trying to make a point, well, not even trying to make a point, like share my reaction to the film and watching it on the big screen, and talking about how, it is quite demanding. It's a 3.5-hour film, and I watched it at 6 p.m. on a Monday. Like, it's not an easy watch. But I loved it, and I do love it as a film. And, Ben was like, oh, like Sight and Sound, is this one of those wonky, like, publications? And I'm like, well, I don't want you to talk I don't want you to talk like that. We can't just be talking about James Bond every freaking time. And I pushed back on that idea. And I think he got the point, and he stopped talking after that. But this is where I'm trying to push back, in terms of like, well, it's not just franchises and James Bond. Like, let's talk about something else that offers a different perspective. And I mean, they're obviously like very open to these things, but again, we're friends, so sometimes we fight, but we also love each other.
And it's and I think sometimes, again, that feeds into the fact that everybody has a kind of very specific sense of what it means to be a film watcher. I mean, you've just sort of talked a little bit about it there in the context of the podcast, but I don't know, how do you feel about these labels that we either reject or accept, things like cinephile or film fan or critic, or, I mean, you've got film nerd on your podcast, which again is a very these are all enunciations, aren't they, of this is my being in relationship to film. What do you think about those?
Yeah, I think I may need to update Film Nerd because I don't identify. I think I don't identify with that, but I think people like Ben are incredible, and I do think they're proper film nerds because what I call a film nerd would be someone like him who literally knows his films scene by scene. He knows every piece of dialogue. He knows who was the sound design. Like he knows everything about its film, and I think that's the film nerdiness of it all. I have a terrible memory. I see films 50 times and I still forget about them. So probably not film nerd feels right for me. But it's a very good question because my relationship with cinema labels is complicated because whose isn't? I'm sure you have a complicated relation with cinema labels in 2025 as well. But I've been thinking a lot about them. So to me, cinephile does feel the closest because if we go back to its roots, like philos of cinema in Greek means a friend of film, which feels quite authentic to me to be a friend of film. Well, that's lovely, but I often do hesitate to claim it because there is this unspoken expectation that being a cinephile means being able to debate the finer points of, I don't know, Italian neorealism, and I can't do that. And for a long time, it has made me feel like an imposter. But I have come to realize that my perspective, which is shaped by years in marketing actually, and specifically film marketing, offers something different in a way. I am personally fascinated by how films communicate with audiences, like how they land or how they miss their intended impact. I'm less interested in critiquing like technical elements because again, I admittedly know very little about, and I'm more drawn to exploring how cinema helps us understand our culture and ourselves. So I purposely avoid saying I write traditional film criticism because I'm not here to write reviews or, generate hot takes. There are plenty of people that do that already and they're doing it very well. But what interests me is how films work as these incredible vessels for perspective. So maybe I'm something more between a cultural observer and a cinema enthusiast. I don't love the word enthusiast, but that's what it feels like. I care deeply about how, movies shape our understanding of the world, but I'm approaching this from the perspective of someone who spent years thinking about how messages reach audiences, right? I'm not someone who's steeped in film theory.
No, it's fascinating because you mentioned on the emails that we had back and forth about setting this up, you sort of mentioned that a little bit. And, because I've taught film, I studied film at university, but I often feel like sometimes that does provide a barrier because it means that when something comes up, you automatically go back to the thing that you were taught or you read about that back in the day, and it's like, oh well, that relates back to that, and it means that you don't have I don't know whether the emotional bandwidth or the intellectual flexibility to be able to leave that behind. I think that's quite difficult when you're writing, and this is the part where I kind of blow smoke up your ass. You'll be familiar with that phrase, I'm sure. But like, for example, your David Lynch piece had a big impact on me this morning. It gave me that ambivalent feeling of kind of sort of awe, really, in the sense that the content was released so beautifully by the craft in the way that was so complete. I was like, wow. But I also felt quite sad because I'm like, I can't write like that. Do you know? Seriously. And it was like, it's that thing where you read something and this is great, but I'm just going to give up now because I can't do that, So, there's an emotional imagination in your writing, which I really appreciate. But it's also clear that, just on that Lynch piece, that you clearly had something really a lot to say about him, and beyond a lot of the stuff that I've read, which is just kind of like, I met Lynch once, or his films do this,
Wow. Okay.
No, not me. I'm saying.
Sorry.
No.
So I thought you said I met Lynch, and I'm like, whoa, tell me about that.
No. I wish. What I'm saying was a lot of the pieces are anecdotes which are based on, from critics are like, oh, but I met Lynch, which is a kind of, I don't know whether they can be self-aggrandizing, but you clearly had something very clear that you wanted to say about Lynch as an artist beyond just a filmmaker. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
Of course. My perspective on him is and was, well, has been. I've always been less interested in his films, and I have gone on record about that, mostly because I have seen a few of his films and I find them incredibly difficult to watch. And I think I've mentioned the piece briefly that he creates worlds that I feel very uncomfortable in. So when I wanted to write something about his films didn't come to mind because that's just not the best way and most authentic way for me to honor him. But Lynch has been a very Instagram sort of filmmaker, and I'm sure if you follow those big cinema pages, you're gonna have the classic Tarantino and Nolan and Lynch. And one thing that I remember from the past 5-6 years of my following those pages is that they always talked about and they highlighted his quotes that were much less so about his filmmaking legacy and how he made Mulholland Drive, and much more about his manifestos and his worldviews and philosophies on art. And I thought to myself, I feel like that's a much more authentic and perhaps understated way of honoring him as a person, because a man died, and not just a filmmaker. It was a human. It was a person. So I was briefly familiar with some of his works and creations, the Paris nightclub and things like that. But then I had to do a bit of research around the comic book strip and just see what that was about. And then the more I kept looking into him, I realized, oh my God, this man was a filmmaker, but that was 5% of what he was all about. So I thought that was a much more authentic way of honoring him as a human being. And while I was writing the piece, I realized that I was much more drawn into his stuff, from his furniture to the furniture he made to the poetry he wrote. That all of that spoke much more to me compared to his films.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. I mean, I'm going to well, I've already shared it, but I'm going to share it in conjunction with this, when this goes out as well, because this will be on the show notes and everything. I want to finish off by talking quite a bit about about this piece that inspired me to get in touch, because it really sort of sat with me in ways that I again agreed with, and then there was other kind of caveats when I was reading. I thought, oh, well, what about this? Well, what about that? So I'm going to politely kind of get, push back on some things.
Of course.
But just before we even just sort of get into that, I mean, are you somebody who still sort of believes or kind of thinks about that relationship between, say, auditorium viewing versus streaming? Because I've gone back and forth over my life in terms of the importance of watching in the cinema. And right at this moment, I'm kind of like, we should be, whenever possible, we should be trying to go back to the cinema, because there is something unique about the auditorium experience, which, almost in a kind of philosophical way, but in an experiential way, gives us something that just watching at home never can.
Yeah. It's fascinating because cinema, I would say for me, is my meditative state of being. When I'm in the cinema, that's my meditative state of being. I do think it's quite crucial. I also think it's a muscle that needs to be trained. So
That's interesting.
oh, absolutely, because we live in a world where, I mean, I'm not saying anything new here. Our attention spans are collectively shrinking. So in order to be able to enjoy going to the cinema, you need to train that muscle that is happy to sit next to strangers in a dark room, and being able not to look at your phone, being able to not, have a bunch of distractions around you, not being able to, fold your laundry while you're watching something, and actually be quite present and almost come back to your physical presence, go back to your physical being. And I think today this is extremely difficult for people. I think people actively push back against the idea of being alone with their own thoughts. So that's really, really hard for everyone. At the same time, I'm not precious about home viewing. I do watch films at home, as I think most people, but I do think they serve very different purposes. I do believe that both of them offer a sense of intimacy, but I think the former creates intimacy with the screen and with the work in front of you, while the latter creates intimacy with the people that you watch a film with. Because I like watching films with other people, and when I watch films at home, I don't actually watch films alone as much. When I do watch films at home, I try to use them as a collective experience where you can, you can pause the film, but you discuss theories with other people, almost like a collective and shared experience. So in my head, like, cinema viewing is all about, train and be there with your thoughts and like train yourself to have that focused attention, while home viewing is much more about that collective experience. And being able, I know you mentioned cinema etiquette in our back and forth, being able to have those conversations, but in a place and time where you can have these conversations respectfully.
Yeah.
So but yeah, of course there is something irresistible about the cinema viewing, and I do make an active effort to go once a week, because I think it's because I've been able to maintain that practice. And it is a practice. It's not like a choice. It's a practice that you have to make every single week. I'm now able to watch like 3 back-to-back films in a festival. But I think it's because, I've trained that muscle. So yeah, we are at this very difficult and strange time where, cinema viewing has become this battleground for both individual expression, because you have people showing up with their phones wanting to express how they showed up at a Wicked screening, and almost at this quiet co experience of something in front of us. It's interesting.